Welcome to 11 Recaps. If you enjoy this summary, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. It really helps me keep bringing you engaging content. Ready for your support? Awesome, thank you. Let's dive in. Nick Morton's eyes snapped open, the cold bite of a body bag pressing against his skin. His breath caught, ragged and uneven, as the sterile hum of the morgue buzzed in his ears. He clawed at the plastic, tearing it open with trembling hands, and stumbled upright, his bare feet slapping against the tiled floor. The room spun, steel tables, flickering lights, the faint smell of antiseptic and decay. He was alive. Impossibly, undeniably alive. His last memory was chaos. A plane spiraling through the English sky, crows smashing into the cockpit, Jenny's wide eyes as he shoved a parachute into her arms. He'd felt the impact, the shattering of metal and bone. He'd died. Hadn't he? A shadow shifted in the corner of his vision. Nick turned, heart hammering, and there stood Chris Vale, his best friend, his partner in crime, the man he'd shot dead on that doomed flight. Chris leaned against a steel cabinet, arms crossed, his grin crooked and too calm for a dead man. "You look like hell, Nick," he said, voice low and teasing. "Guess that makes two of us." "What the hell is going on?" Nick demanded, his voice cracking. He took a step forward, but Chris didn't move, didn't flinch. "You're dead. I killed you." Chris tilted his head, his eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Yeah, you did. But you already know why I'm here, don't you?" Before Nick could answer, the morgue door swung open. Jenny Halsey burst in, flanked by two wide-eyed doctors, her face paling as she locked eyes with him. "Nick!" Her voice trembled, caught between relief and disbelief. "You're alive?" He wanted to say something sharp, something to cut through the fog in his head, but all he managed was a hoarse surprise. She rushed toward him, her hands hovering as if afraid he'd vanish. The doctors muttered behind her, their words a blur of medical jargon and shock. But Nick's gaze drifted back to Chris, still standing there, unseen by anyone else. A chill crawled up his spine. Whatever had brought him back, it wasn't natural. And deep down, he knew it had something to do with her. The woman in the sarcophagus, the one who'd whispered to him in the dark. Days earlier, in the blistering heat of Iraq, Nick and Chris had crouched behind a crumbling wall, bullets pinging off the stone. The memory hit Nick like a punch, sharp and vivid, as he sat in the morgue, Jenny's voice fading into the background. He could still feel the sweat trickling down his neck, hear Chris muttering curses under his breath. "This is a bad idea, man," Chris had said, peering over the wall at the insurgent soldiers swarming the valley below. "We're gonna get smoked for some crazy doctor's paycheck." Nick had smirked, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Relax. Dr. Henry's got deep pockets, and I've got a hunch this site's worth it." It was a lie, of course. He didn't care about hunches or history. He cared about cash, about the next score. But something about the job, about the coordinates Henry had slipped him, tugged at him. Maybe it was greed. Maybe it was fate. They'd called in the airstrike when the gunfire pinned them down, a desperate move that shook the earth and split the ground wide open. Nick remembered the vertigo as he'd stumbled to the edge of the newly formed crater, staring down into the black maw of a tomb. He'd nearly fallen in, his boots slipping on loose dirt, until Chris yanked him back. "You trying to die early?" Chris had snapped, but his eyes had widened at the sight below, carved stone, glinting mercury, a secret buried deep. That's when Colonel Greenway had shown up, his helicopter kicking up dust as he strode toward them, his face a mask of suspicion. "What the hell are you two doing out here?" He'd barked, hands on his hips. "This isn't a rescue op. You're looting, aren't you? Selling relics on the black market." Nick had thrown up his hands, all charm and denial. Whoa, Colonel. We got intel about insurgents threatening villagers. Just doing our civic duty." Chris had nodded along, too quick, too eager, and Greenway's scowl had deepened. But before the argument could escalate, she'd arrived, Jenny Halsey, storming across the sand with a map crumpled in her fist and fury in her eyes. She'd slapped Nick hard enough to make his head snap sideways. "You bastard," she'd hissed. "Baghdad 3 nights ago. You slept with me and stole this from my bag." She'd shoved the map in his face, then froze, her gaze dropping to the hole in the ground. "That's Egyptian," she'd murmured, confusion replacing her anger. "This is Persian territory. It doesn't make sense." Nick had rubbed his stinging cheek, watching her shift gears from scorned lover to archaeologist in an instant. She'd turned to Greenway, all business. "I'm going in. This could be worth billions, artifacts, history, you name it. My job's to secure it." Greenway had sighed, then jabbed a finger at Nick and Chris. You two go with her. 2 hours, Max insurgents are still out there. Back in the morgue, Nick's hands clenched as the memory of the tomb flooded back. Jenny was still talking, something about crash reports and miracles, but he barely heard her. He could see it. The mercury dripping from the ceiling, silver beads splashing into canals that snaked through the chamber. Jenny had explained it, her voice steady despite the gloom. Egyptians used mercury to ward off evil spirits. This place is sealed tight. Chris had wandered off, pocketing jewelry from the skeletons lining the walls, his whispers barely audible over the drip-drip of liquid metal. Nick had followed Jenny deeper, her flashlight cutting through the dark to reveal statues, guardians she'd called them, facing inward, toward a pool of mercury. They're not protecting something, she'd said, her brow furrowing. They're imprisoning it. Chains dangled into the pool, taut and heavy, designed to hold something down, not lift it up. This isn't a tomb, she'd concluded, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's a prison. Greenway's voice had crackled through the radio then, sharp and urgent. Get out now. Insurgents inbound. Jenny had shaken her head, stubborn as ever. Not without seeing what's down there. Chris had argued, his nerves fraying, but Nick had silenced them both, spotting the pulley system, aiming his gun and firing. The chains rattled, and up came the sarcophagus, black and ominous, rising from the mercury like a nightmare given form. Spiders had erupted from the walls, skittering over stone and bone. One sank its fangs into Chris, who'd cursed and fired wildly, bullets ricocheting. Calm down, Nick had snapped, grabbing his arm. They're not poisonous. But his attention had drifted to the sarcophagus, its carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. And then she was there, not Jenny, but her, a woman with eyes like obsidian, her voice a silken thread in his mind. You've set me free, she'd whispered. You're mine now. Nick blinked, the morgue snapping back into focus. Jenny was shaking his shoulder, her face tight with worry. Nick, you're zoning out. What's wrong? He couldn't tell her, not yet. Not about the voice, the vision, the way his skin crawled with something ancient and alive. Instead, he muttered, we need to get that sarcophagus out of here, and followed her as she led him away, the ghost of Chris trailing behind. The helicopter ride from Iraq replayed in his mind as they walked. The sarcophagus swinging beneath the chopper, crows circling it like vultures drawn to carrion. He'd watched them from the window, unease gnawing at him, while Chris slumped in his seat, pale and sweating from the spider bite. No one had noticed how bad he was getting, not even Nick, too busy flirting with Jenny on the plane ride home. I didn't steal that map because I don't care, he'd told her, leaning close as the plane hummed over the desert. I feel something for you, Jen. Real stuff. She'd scoffed, brushing him off. You steal history, Nick. My life's work. You don't get it. She'd turned to the sarcophagus, tracing its inscriptions, her voice softening as she read aloud the tale of Princess Amenet. Betrayed by her father, pact bound to Set, mummified alive. Nick had seen it then, a vision overlaying her words. Amenet's rage, her knife raised, and him, as the vessel for her god. Chris had lurched up mid-flight, eyes blank, stabbing at the sarcophagus with a knife. Greenway had wrestled him down, only to take a blade to the chest. Nick had shot Chris, 2 rounds, center mass, watching his friend crumple. Then the crows had come, a black storm smashing the plane apart. Nick had strapped the parachute on Jenny, pushed her out, and braced for the end. Now, in a London bar, Nick nursed a beer, Jenny across from him, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. You shouldn't be alive, she said, her voice steady but her eyes searching. No one survives that kind of crash. He shrugged, forcing a grin. Guess I'm lucky. But he wasn't. Chris lingered in the corner of his eye, a constant reminder of the curse sinking its claws into him. Jenny leaned forward, lowering her voice. There's a story, an Egyptian princess erased from history. Amenet. She tried to summon Set with a dagger, its jewels stolen by crusaders. Those tombs they just found under the Thames? I think the jewel's there. We woke her up, Nick. The gods aren't happy. He wanted to laugh it off, but Chris's voice echoed in his head, cold and clear. We're cursed, man. She's got plans for you. In the bathroom, Chris appeared in the mirror, his reflection smirking. You can't run from her. She's in your blood now. Outside, in an alley, the vision hit hard. Amenet, radiant and terrible, mice swarming at her feet. Nick stumbled into traffic, tires screeching, until Jenny yanked him back. It's her, he gasped, clutching his head. She's real. Jenny frowned, practical even now. Mercury poisoning, maybe. From the tomb. But he saw the doubt in her eyes, the fear she wouldn't voice. Meanwhile, Aminette had risen. The crash site officer who'd opened her sarcophagus was her first victim, his life sucked dry, his body enslaved. She'd moved through London, draining more, her form growing stronger, more human. Nick felt her pull, an itch he couldn't scratch. At the crash site, he veered toward a church, drawn by her voice. Her slave seized him, and she emerged, dagger in hand, its jewel missing. Jenny's interruption saved him, but Aminette's pursuit didn't end. Their car crashed, mummies closing in, until men with strange weapons intervened, knocking Nick out. He woke in Prodigium's lair, Dr. Henry Jekyll looming over him. A man with a secret, his own evil caged by a serum. Jenny's allegiance to Prodigium stung, but Aminette's capture gave them a plan, Mercury to kill her. Yet she whispered to Nick, promising immortality, power, a throne beside her. Henry's true intent, to let Set possess Nick, then kill him, unleashed chaos. Nick fought Hyde, freed Aminette by accident, and fled with Jenny to the Crusader tombs. The London Underground was a battlefield, sandstorms, mummies, Chris's betrayal leading them to Aminette. Underwater, Jenny drowned, and Nick, desperate, stabbed himself with the dagger, letting Set in to save her. He drained Aminette, revived Jenny, then fled, a monster seeking a cure, Chris at his side. In Egypt, they rode into the desert, a sandstorm trailing Nick's newfound power, his humanity fraying but unbroken. Thank you for watching.